Hi, I'm Naomi. Nice to meet you. Before I tell you my story, kindly hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I like to know where you're from. Now let's dive in. I still remember the envelope. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with gold edges. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a statement. You belong here for now. Margaret Peterson, my mother-in-law, was throwing herself a week-long birthday extravaganza in Paris. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, a private river cruise on the Seine, a masquerade ball in a rented chateau. The kind of celebration that only the old-money aristocracy could dream up, dripping with pretension and power. When the invitation landed in my mailbox, it felt like a peace offering. I'd been married to James for 6 years, and in all that time, his family treated me like the underdressed extra in their gilded movie. They smiled politely in public, but the digs were constant. Oh, you planned this wedding yourself? How quaint. Your parents own a bookstore? How charmingly small town. I learned to swallow my pride. Until 3 weeks ago. That's when I overheard James on the phone in his study. His voice was low, conspiratorial. At first, I thought he was talking to a client. Then I heard my name. She'll never see it coming. Paris will be perfect, public, sophisticated. Margaret announces the separation, everyone sees she wasn't fit for this family, and then, well, we'll manage the press from there. My blood went cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding my breath. Then came the gut punch. And yes, I'm still seeing Claire. She understands the kind of life I want. Claire, the junior associate from his firm. The one with the bright laugh and bottomless trust fund. I remember walking away from that door, feeling like my ribs were splintering inward. 3 days before the Petersons were set to fly to Paris, I made my first move. I waited until James had left for a late client dinner and poured myself a glass of wine, not because I needed the courage, but because I wanted to savor the moment. I picked up the phone and called Monsieur Lefebvre, the owner of Chateau de Montreuil. I'd worked with him twice before on political fundraisers, and he knew I delivered high-profile clients. His voice came on the line warm and polished, but I could hear the faint tension when I mentioned Margaret Peterson's name. It wasn't the first time she'd booked with him. Last year, she'd pulled a stunt where she demanded last-minute menu changes, refused to pay the overtime fees, and then hinted to her socialite circle that the chateau wasn't up to standard. The man had a long memory. I have another client for that date, I said smoothly. Someone who can pay 50% more up front. But you'd have to free up the night. Silence. Then a sigh. If Mrs. Peterson wishes to cancel, she must inform us. I smiled to myself. She doesn't need to. I'm handling her event logistics now. Things have changed. A wire transfer later, the masquerade ball was no longer on their calendar. In its place was a corporate launch party for a Parisian luxury brand, and the Petersons would be walking into a locked gate if they tried to show up. Strike one. But that was only the appetizer. The next day, I called in another favor. This time with Leo, a maitre d' at L'Ambroisie, where the Petersons had booked an intimate dinner for 20 close friends. Leo had a weakness for front-row tickets to Paris Fashion Week, which I could get with a single text. By noon, he'd agreed to accidentally double-book their table with a foreign dignitary's security-heavy entourage. The Petersons wouldn't just lose their dinner. They'd be told, in front of their guests, that they had no reservation at all. Meanwhile, I reached out to my friend in the Paris gossip circuit, Sophie. She ran a popular Instagram account that was basically the city's unofficial social diary. A discreet message to her, hinting about a certain American family struggling to pay their bills on time, was enough to plant seeds. She wouldn't name names yet, but the right circles would connect the dots when the cancellation started. By the time James and I boarded the plane to Paris, I was calm, almost serene. He spent most of the flight texting, grinning at his phone like a teenager. I didn't need to guess who it was. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and imagined Margaret's expression when her grand masquerade turned into a locked gate and a very awkward scene. When we landed, the family's chauffeur whisked us straight to the Ritz. Margaret greeted me in the lobby with air kisses and a look that said she'd rather be swallowing nails. James played the attentive husband for show, his hand at the small of my back, his voice dripping with false warmth. The first dinner passed without incident, by design. I needed them comfortable, still believing the stage was theirs. But on the morning of the masquerade, Margaret was already dressed for war, barking at her assistant in the hotel suite. "Make sure the cars are ready by 7. I want champagne in the back. Naomi, you'll wear the gown James's stylist picked out, yes?" I smiled sweetly. Of course. By 8, the Peterson convoy rolled through the Paris streets toward the chateau. The family chattered about guest lists and seating arrangements, completely oblivious. My heart was steady. I timed everything perfectly. We turned the corner, and the gates loomed ahead. Locked. The lights inside were bright, but the music was all wrong. Jazzy modern, not the opulent waltz Margaret had demanded. A young hostess approached, confusion in her eyes. "I'm sorry, madam, this is a private corporate event. The chateau is closed for the night." The silence in the limo was delicious. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like she'd swallowed her own pearls. James's phone was already in his hand, frantically dialing. I just sipped my champagne. The ride back to the Ritz that night was silent, except for Margaret's clipped breathing and James's furious thumb taps on his phone. No one looked at me. I sat there, calm as still water, while my mind moved like a current beneath the surface. The chateau disaster was just the first fracture. My next moves would widen the crack until their whole perfect glass facade shattered. The Petersons didn't just trade in money. They traded in perception. Every friendship, every deal, every invitation hinged on their image as the flawless, untouchable family with bottomless wealth. Which meant if I could see doubt about that wealth, it would spread faster than truth ever could. The morning after the chateau debacle, I slipped out early, claiming I needed a walk to clear my head. In reality, I was meeting Sophie at a cafe near the Place Vendôme. She was dressed in oversized sunglasses and sipping espresso, every inch the Parisian insider. "I posted the first photo," she said, sliding her phone toward me. It was a shot of the chateau gates from last night, Margaret's limo just barely visible, and the caption read, "When even old money can't get you past the door, tough week for certain guests in town." Already, the comments were buzzing. Who? Why? What happened? Sophie didn't answer any of them, of course. Mystery was the accelerant. From there, I hit the financials. I knew James's firm had recently taken a hit from a bad investment, and Margaret had been covering their shortfalls with quiet loans from her own trust. That trust was tied to a few key Paris vendors I now had on speed dial. It took 3 discreet phone calls. 1, the hotel's events manager. 2, the river cruise company. 3, the florist contracted for the final gala. To each one, I simply asked if their invoices had been paid yet. They hadn't. And while I didn't tell them to cancel outright, I made sure to express concern about the Peterson solvency. Vendors panic quickly in this business. A whispered doubt can close more doors than a locked gate. By that evening, Margaret's phone was a storm of calls from frantic assistants. The florist threatened to withhold the grand centerpiece delivery unless they got their deposit by noon. The cruise company wanted payment in full within 24 hours, or they'd release the booking. And then there was the dinner at L'Ambroisie. We arrived, all dressed like royalty, only to be told the reservation had been mistakenly given away. Leo executed his part flawlessly, even managing a sympathetic shrug as he escorted a famous French actress past us into the dining room. The Petersons were left standing in the foyer, gawked at by tourists snapping pictures. By now, the whispers had become open speculation. That night, Sophie posted a second image, a blurry shot of Margaret arguing with a maitre d', captioned, "Paris can be cruel when the shine fades." James was livid. He paced the hotel suite, blaming the staff, the French, even bad luck. But I could see it in his eyes, fear. He knew their grip on the week was slipping, and he didn't know where the cracks were coming from. Margaret, for her part, doubled down. She called for an emergency family meeting the next morning. We all sat in the Ritz's grand salon while she lectured about salvaging their dignity and controlling the narrative. She didn't realize the narrative was already out of her hands. I just sipped my coffee and listened. Every word she spoke was a reminder. In Paris, control is an illusion. And I was the one holding the strings. The river cruise was next on the chopping block. And this time, the fallout wouldn't just bruise their pride, it would drag James's little secret into the light. The morning of the river cruise, Paris was unusually bright. The Seine shimmered like glass, and tourists lined the embankments with cameras, ready to capture their perfect postcards. For the Petersons, the day was supposed to be their grand rebound. Margaret had ordered everyone to be at their most elegant for the photographers she'd discreetly invited aboard. Nothing says we're still powerful like gliding down the Seine with champagne in hand. Too bad the champagne would never be poured. 3 nights earlier, while James slept beside me, phone face down, I had sent an anonymous email to the cruise company's manager. The gist was simple. A concerned party had learned that a certain American booking was connected to a man with an ongoing extramarital affair, and that said mistress would be present on the cruise under false pretenses. The email regretfully warned that Parisian society might not appreciate being photographed with such scandal in the backdrop. Now, here's the thing about Paris vendors. They may smile, they may nod, but they live for drama. By the time the Petersons arrived at the dock, the staff already had a plan. We were met at the gangway by the cruise director, her politeness almost too smooth. "I'm so sorry, Madame Monsieur," she began in French, "but there's been a last-minute private booking for the entire vessel. The party boarding now has exclusivity." Margaret bristled. "Impossible. We confirmed this weeks ago." The director's smile didn't falter. "Yes, but the deposit for your event never cleared. And there's been some concern over certain guest conflicts. We thought it best to avoid an uncomfortable scene." Right on cue, I saw her, Claire, stepping onto the deck of the ship in a cream silk dress, laughing with a group of young, glossy Parisians. She spotted James. Her smile froze, and she turned away too quickly. The optics were perfect. James's mistress already aboard, and us left stranded on the pier. The photographers Margaret had invited? They were still there, snapping away. The Paris gossip mill didn't need context. It just needed images. James's jaw tightened until I thought it might crack. Margaret looked from him to me and back again, suspicion flickering in her eyes. She didn't have proof, but the seed was planted. Her golden son was not the loyal husband she thought. We retreated to the Ritz in a haze of barely controlled rage. Margaret ordered the curtains drawn in her suite, muttering about enemies and sabotage. James avoided me entirely, locking himself in the bedroom with his phone. By evening, the damage had spilled online. Sophie's account posted a candid shot of us on the dock, the caption dripping with implication. "When the guest list sinks the ship before it sails, #Paris scandals." The comments were relentless. Speculation about the other woman, guesses about who she was, even a few sharp-eyed followers matching Claire's face to old corporate photos. Margaret tried to spin it, claiming we'd chosen to cancel due to weather concerns. But the weather was perfect, and everyone knew it. That night, while James showered, I slipped into the sitting room with my laptop. One more strike, I told myself. One that would make the week's chaos irreversible. The final gala was scheduled for the Hotel de Crillon, the most prestigious and most gossiped about venue in Paris. I'd already arranged for their payment to accidentally bounce. But now I went further. I sent the Crillon's events team a discreet list of security concerns, including the names of certain high-profile guests who might not want to share a room with the Petersons after their recent reputational troubles. By the time James emerged from the shower, the email was sent, the trap laid. The next night would be the climax. And this time, I wouldn't just take their events. I'd take their ability to ever host one again. By the afternoon of the final gala, the Petersons were fraying at the seams. Margaret had gone through 3 different stylists, rejecting each dress they brought her. James had barely spoken to me since the river cruise debacle, though I caught him glancing at me with something new in his eyes. Worry, maybe even fear. The Hotel de Crillon gleamed like a jewel as we pulled up. The doormen stood in perfect symmetry, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. It should have been a triumphal arrival. Instead, the air in the limo felt like a tomb. We stepped inside. The lobby was hushed, almost too hushed. Margaret led the way to the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. But when we reached the grand double doors, the hotel's events director was waiting. "Madam Peterson," he began, his tone formal but cold, "I'm afraid the Crillon cannot host your event this evening." Margaret's face went rigid. "That's absurd. We have a contract." The director didn't flinch. Your deposit was returned this morning after certain security concerns were brought to our attention. We have decided it is in the best interest of our guests to cancel. The word cancel echoed in the vaulted hallway. Around us, a few early arrivals lingered, their eyes darting between Margaret and the director. Phones were already out. I watched Margaret's color drain as realization set in. There was no salvaging this. The Peterson name wasn't just bruised. It was bleeding out in real time. James stepped forward, trying to contain the situation. "We'll take this outside." "No," Margaret snapped, voice trembling. "We are not moving. This hotel will regret." But the director was already turning away. The matter closed. The whispers behind us grew louder, each one a dagger to their reputation. I slipped away from the cluster of guests and down the hall, pulling out my phone. Sophie's latest post was already live, a shot of the Krillins' gilded doors, captioned simply, "When even Paris says no, #Peterson Week." By the time I returned, James was pacing, Margaret was on the verge of tears, and their entourage was scattering like pigeons in the wind. That was my cue. I walked up to James, my voice low and even. You know, for people who love control, you let it slip through your fingers pretty easily. His eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" I smiled. "Nothing you wouldn't have done to me. The difference is, I'm better at it." I didn't wait for his reply. I turned, walked out into the Paris night, and let the cool air fill my lungs. The Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance, but for the first time all week, I didn't care about the scenery. I cared about the weight that had lifted. The Petersons would spend months, maybe years, clawing their way back from this. And James? He could have Claire, or whoever else was foolish enough to buy into his world. I was done. 2 days later, I was back in New York, sitting in my office with a coffee and a folder of new client contracts. Paris was behind me. The Petersons were still making headlines for all the wrong reasons. And me? I had my dignity, my business, and my freedom. In their world, revenge was a scandal. In mine, it was an art form. If you enjoyed my story, don't forget to like and hit subscribe. You will also enjoy other stories on AJ Family Drama. Until next time, bye.